In the winter of 1942, a coded telegram arrived at coastal defense stations across Britain. The message was brief, classified as top secret, and contained instructions that would remain hidden from the public for decades. It read, "Under no circumstances are civilians to be informed of the true nature of submarine activity in home waters. All incidents must be attributed to naval exercises or mechanical failures." The order was clear. The truth about what was happening beneath the waves along Britain's shores had to be concealed at all costs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What the government feared was not just panic, but the complete collapse of morale in a nation already stretched to its breaking point. Because the reality lurking in the cold Atlantic depths was far more terrifying than anyone outside the Admiralty dared to admit. German U-boats had penetrated far closer to British soil than official reports would ever acknowledge, and the carnage they inflicted went far beyond military targets. By late 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had evolved into a ruthless war of attrition. Convoys carrying vital supplies from North America to Britain faced constant threat from wolf packs, coordinated groups of German submarines that hunted in deadly formation. The official narrative presented to the British public spoke of brave naval engagements, strategic losses, and the occasional merchant vessel sunk far out at sea. Newspapers printed sanitized accounts, maps showed sinkings occurring hundreds of miles from shore, and casualty figures were carefully managed to avoid alarm. But behind closed doors at the Admiralty headquarters in London, a different picture emerged. Intelligence reports detailed incidents that never made it into public consciousness. U-boats were operating not just in the mid-Atlantic, but within sight of the British coastline. They lurked in shipping lanes near major ports, waiting for targets. Some had even penetrated the Irish Sea, the English Channel, and the waters off Scotland where fishing villages dotted the rugged shores. The proximity of these attacks created a dilemma that military planners had never anticipated. Where a freighter exploded within view of a coastal town, when bodies washed ashore still wearing life vests, when wreckage drifted into harbors bearing the scorch marks of torpedo strikes, how could the government maintain the fiction that the war remained safely distant? The answer lay in systematic deception, a campaign of misdirection that would require cooperation from local authorities, police forces, harbor masters, and even clergy. In small fishing communities along the northeastern coast of England, strange occurrences became routine in the months following that secret telegram. Explosions heard in the night were explained away as training exercises conducted by the Royal Navy. When debris washed ashore, coastal patrols arrived swiftly to cordon off beaches, often before dawn, removing evidence before civilians could examine it too closely. Fishermen who ventured out at first light sometimes returned with tails of oil slicks stretching for miles, the unmistakable signature of a sunken vessel, yet when they reported these sightings, officials dismissed them as natural seepage or spillage from damaged barrels. The deception extended to the families of merchant seamen. When ships vanished without trace, next of kin received standardized letters expressing regret for losses attributed to storms, mechanical failure, or in the vaguest terms possible, enemy action in the Atlantic theater. The letters never mentioned specific locations. They never described the circumstances. They certainly never revealed that many of these men had died within a few miles of home, torpedoed by submarines that had slipped past coastal defenses under cover of darkness. In Scotland's Orkney Islands, where the Royal Navy maintained the vital anchorage at Scapa Flow, civilians lived under constant surveillance. The archipelago had been fortified extensively after a daring U-boat raid in World War I had sunk the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. Despite these defenses, German submarines continued to probe the area, testing the barriers, searching for weaknesses. On several occasions, periscopes were spotted by lookouts. Depth charges rumbled through the water, sending shockwaves that rattled windows in nearby homes. Yet when islanders asked what was happening, they were told it was routine anti-submarine practice. The official line maintained that no enemy vessels had approached the islands since the early months of the war. This was a lie. Classified documents revealed that at least 7 separate U-boat incursions had been detected in those waters between 1941 and 1943, some coming dangerously close to the fleet anchorage itself. The psychological impact of living under such secrecy was profound. Coastal residents developed a kind of double consciousness. They heard explosions, saw mysterious patrols, noticed the tension in the faces of naval officers who came ashore, yet they were expected to accept bland official explanations that contradicted their own senses. In pubs and church halls, people spoke in hushed tones about what they suspected but could not prove. Rumors circulated, some wildly exaggerated, others chillingly accurate, but all were quickly suppressed by authorities who invoked wartime censorship laws. Local newspapers operated under strict guidelines. Editors received regular visits from Ministry of Information officials who reviewed every story related to maritime incidents. Any mention of submarine activity near the coast was forbidden. Even human interest stories about missing fishermen or recovered wreckage had to be submitted for approval before publication. Those who violated these rules faced prosecution under the Defense of the Realm Act, which carried penalties including imprisonment. The secrecy order also affected rescue operations. When ships were torpedoed close to shore, the response had to be carefully managed. Survivors who made it to land were immediately taken into custody, not for interrogation in the criminal sense, but for what officials termed protective isolation. They were housed in secure facilities, often former hotels or country estates requisitioned for the war effort, where they received medical care and were debriefed extensively. During these debriefings, they were reminded in no uncertain terms that discussing the circumstances of their ordeal with anyone outside authorized personnel constituted a breach of national security. Many survivors complied out of patriotism, understanding that loose talk could endanger future convoys. Others struggled with the psychological burden of carrying such knowledge. They had watched shipmates die, had spent hours in freezing water waiting for rescue, had seen the dark shape of a U-boat's conning tower silhouetted against the night sky, yet they could not speak of it. Some broke down under the strain. Military psychiatrists at the time documented cases of what they called traumatic silence disorder, though it would be decades before the full impact of enforced secrecy on mental health was properly understood. The lengths to which authorities went to maintain this deception were extraordinary. In one documented case from February 1942, a U-boat was depth-charged and forced to surface off the coast of Cornwall. The submarine, badly damaged and unable to dive, attempted to reach the open Atlantic but was intercepted by a destroyer. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. The U-boat was sunk with all hands, its hull settling in relatively shallow water just 8 miles from the village of Newquay. For the Royal Navy, it was a significant victory. For the deception apparatus, it was a crisis. Fishermen had witnessed the action. Wreckage was already drifting toward shore. Within hours, naval personnel were deployed to the area with instructions to secure the site and remove all physical evidence. The official explanation given to locals was that a Royal Navy submarine had been conducting emergency surface drills when it experienced catastrophic mechanical failure. The destroyer, it was claimed, had been attempting a rescue operation. Few believed this story, but few dared to question it openly. Those who tried found themselves visited by police officers who politely but firmly suggested that speculation about military matters was both unwise and unpatriotic. In the local parish church, the vicar was asked to remind his congregation from the pulpit about the importance of discretion in wartime. He complied, though his diary entries from that period, discovered years later, revealed his personal anguish at participating in what he knew to be a lie. The policy of concealment was driven by legitimate strategic concerns. The Admiralty understood that if the British public learned how frequently U-boats operated near home waters, several dangerous consequences might follow. First, there was the risk of panic. Coastal communities might demand evacuations or refuse to cooperate with essential maritime operations. Second, merchant seamen, already facing appalling casualty rates on Atlantic convoys, might refuse to sail if they knew that danger persisted even within sight of home. Third, and perhaps most critically, any public acknowledgement of U-boat presence close to Britain would reveal weaknesses in coastal defenses that the Germans could exploit. There was also a propaganda dimension. Britain's ability to maintain the appearance of control over its own waters was vital to both domestic morale and international perception, particularly in relation to the United States, which had not yet entered the war in those early years. Any suggestion that German submarines roamed freely along the British coast would have been a propaganda gift to Berlin and might have undermined efforts to secure American support. Yet the human cost of this secrecy was real and immediate. Families mourned loved ones whose true fates they would never know. Communities lived in a state of manufactured ignorance, cut off from truth by their own government. The psychological landscape of wartime Britain was shaped not just by what people knew, but by what they sensed but could not name, the unspoken fear that danger was closer than anyone was willing to admit. As 1942 progressed into 1943, the secret order remained in force. The Battle of the Atlantic intensified. More U-boats prowled British waters. More ships were lost. More families received those carefully worded letters that revealed nothing. And through it all, the fiction was maintained. Official maps continued to show sinkings occurring safely distant from shore. Newspapers continued to speak of the Atlantic as if it were some remote battlefield, not the water visible from the bedroom windows of seaside cottages. The truth remained locked away in classified files, in the memories of survivors sworn to silence, in the nightmares of naval officers who knew what lurked beneath the waves, and in the collective unconscious of a nation that suspected more than it was told. The secret order had created a parallel reality where official truth and lived experience existed in permanent tension, where what everyone knew had to be ignored, and where the proximity of death had to be denied even as its evidence washed up on British shores. The winter of 1943 brought with it a shift in the nature of submarine warfare along Britain's coastline. German U-boat commanders, emboldened by their success in the mid-Atlantic and frustrated by improved convoy defenses, began adopting more aggressive tactics. They moved closer to British shores, taking calculated risks to intercept coastal shipping that had previously been considered too dangerous to target. These vessels, smaller freighters and colliers that hugged the coastline rather than venturing into deep water, carried coal from Newcastle, supplies to Scotland, and provisions between ports that kept Britain's war economy functioning. For the civilian population living in port towns from Liverpool to Aberdeen, the escalation of submarine activity manifested in ways that could not be entirely hidden, no matter how determined the authorities were to maintain their fiction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The frequency of mysterious explosions increased. More bodies washed ashore. Fishing boats returned to harbor with stories of periscopes spotted at dawn, of strange metallic shapes glimpsed through morning fog, of underwater sounds that rattled their hulls. Yet each incident was met with the same official response: routine naval operations, mechanical accidents, natural phenomena misidentified by untrained observers. In the town of Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, a community with centuries of maritime tradition found itself at the center of this unacknowledged war. The harbor had long served as a refuge for fishing vessels and small coastal traders. Local families had earned their living from the sea for generations, and they possessed an intimate knowledge of these waters that no amount of official denial could override. When a trawler captain reported seeing a torpedo track pass directly beneath his vessel in broad daylight, only to have it dismissed by harbor authorities as a dolphin or a large fish, the insult to his professional expertise was profound. What the captain and others like him did not know was that naval intelligence had indeed confirmed increased U-boat activity in that exact area. A submarine designated U-247 had been tracked intermittently over several weeks, its commander apparently testing the defenses of the northeastern coast. The boat had sunk 3 small merchant vessels in quick succession, all within 30 miles of Whitby. None of these losses had been publicly reported. The families of the lost crewmen received notifications, but the circumstances remained classified. Insurance companies were quietly compensated by the government on condition of absolute silence about the claims. This pattern repeated itself in harbors and fishing villages throughout Britain. In Wales, the port of Milford Haven experienced a series of incidents that left the community deeply unsettled. Fishermen hauling their nets found them torn and contaminated with diesel oil. Unexploded ordnance appeared on beaches with suspicious regularity. One morning, the town woke to find their harbor filled with dead fish, thousands of them floating on the surface, victims of underwater explosions that official sources attributed to experimental mine clearance operations being conducted in international waters far to the west. The strain on local officials tasked with maintaining these deceptions was considerable. Harbor masters found themselves in impossible positions, required to lie to people they had known their entire lives, men whose judgment they respected and whose concerns they shared. Police constables who patrolled coastal areas wrote reports that were immediately classified and replaced with sanitized versions for public record. Even doctors who treated survivors or examined bodies recovered from the sea were bound by secrecy orders that prevented them from discussing their findings. The psychological toll extended beyond those directly involved in the deception. Ordinary citizens developed a profound distrust of official information, not because they were disloyal, but because their daily experiences contradicted what they were being told. This created a corrosive effect on the social contract between government and governed. People began to assume that everything they heard through official channels was false, which paradoxically made them more susceptible to wild rumors and enemy propaganda that occasionally filtered through despite censorship efforts. German intelligence, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of how effective their coastal campaign had become or how desperately Britain was working to conceal it. U-boat commanders filed reports of successful attacks, but they had no way of knowing the broader impact their presence was having on civilian morale and government policy. Had they understood the panic their proximity was causing among British leadership, they might have intensified these operations even further. The Admiralty's response to the escalating situation was twofold. First, coastal defenses were quietly strengthened. Additional destroyers and corvettes were assigned to patrol duties in home waters, pulled from convoy escort duties despite the risk that entailed. Anti-submarine nets were extended. Listening stations along the coast were upgraded and staffed around the clock. These measures were effective but could not be openly discussed without admitting the threat they were designed to counter. Second, the deception operation itself was expanded and refined. A dedicated unit was established within the Ministry of Information specifically to manage the suppression of submarine-related information. This unit coordinated with naval intelligence, local police forces, coastal observers, and even civilian volunteer organizations like the Royal Observer Corps. Their mandate was to identify any potential breach of secrecy before it could spread and to neutralize it through whatever means necessary, including the strategic release of false information designed to confuse and misdirect. One particularly cynical tactic involved the deliberate creation of fake incidents in areas far from actual submarine activity. Official announcements would reference U-boat sightings or depth charge attacks in locations that were either completely safe or where the Royal Navy had overwhelming superiority. These false reports served multiple purposes. They suggested that the government was being transparent about submarine threats, they directed public attention away from genuinely vulnerable areas, and they allowed authorities to demonstrate their supposed effectiveness in protecting British waters. The human stories that emerged from this period reveal the complexity of living under enforced ignorance. In a village on the Scottish coast, a young woman named Margaret worked at the local post office. Her job involved sorting mail, including the dreaded official telegrams that brought news of deaths at sea. Over several months, she noticed a pattern. The telegrams arriving for families in her village all reported losses in roughly the same area of the North Atlantic, yet the dates of the incidents were staggered in ways that seemed deliberately spaced out. Margaret said nothing, but she began keeping private notes, recording the dates and the sparse details provided in each telegram. What she discovered was that multiple vessels appeared to have been lost on the same days, but the notifications to families were being distributed over weeks to avoid the appearance of a concentrated attack. She shared her findings with no one, understanding instinctively that such knowledge was dangerous, but the burden of knowing weighed heavily on her. Years later, she would describe the experience as living with a secret that everyone shared but no one could acknowledge, a collective awareness that remained forever unspoken. In another community, a Church of England vicar named Thomas found himself caught between his duty to his congregation and his obligation to support the war effort. He had been asked by military authorities to discourage parishioners from discussing certain matters, to emphasize in his sermons the importance of discretion and trust in government. Thomas complied, but his conscience troubled him deeply. He saw families grieving for sons and husbands whose deaths were shrouded in official vagueness. He heard confessions from fishermen who described seeing things at sea that they feared made them sound mad. Thomas began writing detailed letters to his bishop, expressing his moral distress at participating in what he viewed as systematic dishonesty. The bishop's responses, preserved in church archives, reveal the impossible position of religious leaders during this period. They were told that the deception served a greater good, that the prevention of panic justified the suppression of truth, and that their cooperation was essential to national survival. Some accepted this reasoning. Others, like Thomas, struggled with it until the end of their lives. The maritime community itself developed informal networks of information sharing that existed beneath the radar of official surveillance. Fishermen and merchant seamen, when they gathered in pubs or at the docks, would exchange information using careful language that skirted direct acknowledgement of what they all knew. They spoke of areas to avoid, of unusual readings on their instruments, of the changed behavior of seabirds that might indicate disturbances below the surface. This underground knowledge system allowed them to maintain some degree of agency over their own safety even as official channels denied them accurate information. Women whose husbands crewed the coastal vessels developed their own forms of resistance to the imposed silence. They formed support networks, gathering in homes or church basements to share what little information they could glean. These meetings were technically legal, but authorities monitored them nervously, concerned that they might evolve into organized opposition to the secrecy policy. In fact, these gatherings served primarily as spaces for mutual comfort, where the unspoken could be acknowledged through glances and gestures, where the weight of not knowing could be briefly shared. The economic impact of submarine activity in home waters was also carefully concealed. Insurance rates for coastal shipping increased dramatically, but this was attributed to general war risk rather than specific threats. Some shipping companies began refusing to operate certain routes, leading to shortages in particular regions. The government stepped in with subsidies and guarantees, but these interventions were presented as part of routine economic management rather than responses to submarine warfare close to home. By mid-1943, the strain of maintaining the deception had become almost unbearable for those involved in its execution. Naval officers who had initially supported the policy as a necessary evil began questioning whether the psychological damage caused by systematic dishonesty might outweigh the benefits of preventing panic. Some argued in classified memos that the British public had proven resilient enough to handle the truth, pointing to how civilians had endured the Blitz with remarkable courage. These arguments were consistently overruled by senior leadership who feared that admitting the extent of coastal submarine activity would constitute an unacceptable propaganda victory for Germany. The situation reached a critical point in August 1943 when a passenger ferry crossing from Scotland to the Orkney Islands was torpedoed in daylight with significant loss of life. The ferry had been carrying civilian workers and their families to the naval base. Among the dead were women and children. Survivors reported seeing the U-boat surface briefly after the attack, its crew observing the carnage before diving again. This incident could not be entirely suppressed because too many people had witnessed it, including military personnel. The government's response was to classify the sinking as a tragic mistake, claiming the ferry had strayed into a restricted military zone where naval exercises were taking place and had been hit by a misfired weapon from a British vessel. This explanation satisfied almost no one. The survivors knew what they had seen. The families of the dead knew the official story made no sense. But the alternative, admitting that a German submarine had penetrated defenses to strike at a civilian target in supposedly secure waters, was deemed too damaging to acknowledge. The psychological impact on survivors of that ferry attack was devastating, compounded by their inability to speak truthfully about their experience. They were required to repeat the official version of events, even among themselves, even in private conversations. Some complied outwardly while harboring deep resentment. Others broke under the pressure, developing severe anxiety and depression. The few who attempted to speak out publicly were threatened with prosecution under emergency wartime legislation that carried severe penalties. As autumn arrived and the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn in favor of the Allies due to improved convoy tactics and technology, the frequency of U-boat attacks near British shores gradually decreased. Yet the policy of secrecy remained firmly in place. Even as the threat diminished, the apparatus of deception continued to operate, perhaps because those who managed it could not admit that they had been lying, or perhaps because they feared the public reaction if the full scope of the concealment was revealed. The legacy of those years would linger long after the war ended. Communities that had lived under enforced ignorance did not quickly forget. Trust in official institutions had been eroded in ways that would take generations to repair. The individuals who had been compelled to lie, whether they wore uniforms or civilian clothes, carried the weight of those lies forward into peacetime. And the families who never learned the true circumstances of their losses were left with an emptiness that no official condolence could fill. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.